Welcome to Calawegian Fly Fishing with Robert Smart. Now, here's Robert.
Greetings. Now in this video, I'm going to give a tutorial for a beginning fly tyer. This is geared towards somebody that's never tied a fly before in their life, but they want to get into it. I'm just going to use the most basic tools, basic material, and we'll tie 3 simple flies. I think it'll be useful for those folks that want to get into this hobby. It's a great hobby, lots of fun, and there's nothing more satisfying than catching a fish on a fly you tied yourself. So here we go. We're going to start this tutorial right now. Okay, in this tutorial for beginning fly tyers, I'm going to start out with the minimum equipment that you're going to need. Now, if you go on Amazon, there's a lot of beginner kits available. And most of them are around $100. And most of them have all the tools you're going to need, and they give you some material as well. Some hackles, dubbing, that kind of thing. That's a good way to start. There's usually a low-price vise that comes with them, which works just fine. But I'm going to cover some of the equipment as a minimum that you're going to need. Now, obviously, good sharp pair of scissors. And then it's called a bobbin. It holds your thread. Makes it easy to work on the fly. You're going to need a pair of hackle pliers. Hold the end of the hackle when you spin it, or various other uses. Now I use a rotating head hackle pliers. You don't have to have this, but it's something you may want to get in the future. You're going to want to get a whip finisher for tying your knot on the head, the final knot. Very handy tool. It's absolute requirement. Some kind of a pin. They make them with a handle on them. I just got this out of my wife's sewing cabinet. You can use this for putting dubbing, or excuse me, for putting head cement on. I've also got some smaller needles that I use. Not absolutely required, but it's handy, and it comes in most kits. It's a dubbing tool. And I'll show you how to use this. And the last tool I'd recommend, and it's usually not in a kit, but it's a hair stacker. It's used to make the ends of deer hair or any hair that you're using even. Very handy. Makes life a lot simpler. Now, basic material you're going to want to have. You're going to need some dry fly hackles. You can buy them in packs of just a few. Like a quarter cape like this one that gives you various sizes. You'll end up getting several different types. This happens to be a dun color. Now, another feather you're going to want to get, these are neck hackles. They're softer. Use them for tying wet flies, sinking flies. You want to get a pad of deer hair. Flies like the elk hair caddis use elk hair, but you can use deer hair. It's almost the same thing. You need dubbing. You can get a box of this dubbing. They're very cheap, various colors, various types. Some are more bushy, others are finer. Depends on the fly you're tying. You're going to want some ribbing material. You can use, I got this bag of various stuff I use for ribbing. Copper wire is real handy. We're going to use this in our sample fly. Oh yeah. And you're going to need some head cement. Various times you need to glue something on your fly, and head cement works. There's billions of brands out there. I use this Hard as Hull head cement, works really good. There's other types of cements that you can get. You don't need them right now. But one I use a lot anymore is a UV. You put some of this on, you hit it with a UV light, and it gets hard almost immediately. Very, very strong. You don't need that right now. That's more for advanced fly tying. Okay, now that's basically the materials and the equipment that you're going to want to use. Almost forgot. You need a vise. Now, this is the vise that I've been using for over 30 years. This is a rotating vise. Very handy. It's on a heavy platform, so I can put it anywhere I want. Use this portion to, you can adjust it, and it holds your line out of the way if you're doing something. A lot of vices, especially in the kits, won't be rotating vices. Not the end of the world. You can get started without one, but eventually you're going to want to get a rotating vise. It just makes positioning your fly a lot easier. And I would recommend it, but not when you start. Okay, that covers the material and the equipment. Now we're going to tie our first fly. It's going to be kind of a generic mayfly imitation. Now you're going to tie it on, there's various hook sizes. To get started, I'd recommend you get size 10, 12, 14, and 16. The higher the number, the smaller the hook. So a size 10 is much larger than a size 16. A good trout fly, mayfly, size 14 and 16. Bluegill fly, 10 or 12. Now I tie a lot of 18s and 20s, but they're little, real little flies. Little tricky to tie when you start. There's not enough room to work with a lot of times. Eventually you will be tying some 18s and 20s because they do work great. But for now, I'd stick with 10, 12, 14, and 16. That'll get you started, and it'll catch you plenty of fish. So, okay, now we're next phase of this, we're going to tie a kind of a generic mayfly. Okay, now we're going to tie your first fly. This is a size 14 hook. I'm going to use some olive thread. Start your thread. Trim it. We'll run the thread to the back. Make a base. Now most flies you're going to start from the back and work forward. So you think of the sequence of the material. Now, for the tail, I'm just going to take a larger feather, and we're going to just cut off some barbs. Like that. And we want this tail to be about the length of the shank. You start it and then kind of pull them up. Keeps them on top. We just run the thread back. There we got a tail. Okay, now Now we're going to put on what we're going to use for ribbing. In this case, just a piece of this copper wire. And we tie that on. And run our thread back. Okay. Now we're ready to create the body. I'm going to use some dubbing. And I'll use some of this olive dubbing. Take out a small amount. With dubbing, when you think you have enough, you probably have too much. It's easy to add dubbing. It's a little harder to take it off. And then we just twist that. I wet my fingers and just twist that onto your thread. Like that. Called a dubbing noodle. And kind of slide that up to the hook. And you start taking wraps. Bring that forward. We're going to stop that about a third back on the shank. Then we're going to bring our ribbing forward. Nice, evenly spaced wraps. Adds a little bit of something to the body, and it helps hold that dubbing in place. Then we take a few wraps on that, bring the ribbing back, a couple more wraps. Now I can cut that with my scissors, or I can do what's called rotate it, helicopter it. Just like that. And it breaks it right off real close. You can do that with wire. Okay. Now we're going to make a simple deer hair wing on this. You don't need a wing for sure. Take some deer hair. Cut it off. If you don't want to put this wing on, you don't have to. Then we take our stacker. Put the deer hair in the stacker. And I'll tap it on the table several times. And it makes the tips all even. And you brush it to get any loose stuff out. I'm going to point that forward for these wings. Make them about just a hair less than the length of the shaft. Take a couple loose wraps. And then make sure it's all on top. And tighten it down. Another tight wrap, tight wrap, tight wrap. And lift that up, cut that off close, like that. Now we bring all that forward, and we kind of build up a dam in front of it. Like that. Kind of makes it stick up. A few more wraps around that deer hair to the back. You get some stragglers, just cut them off. Okay. Bring your thread back forward. Now we're going to take a hackle. And we want to size it a little big so that the hackles just extend down to the hook point. Now, that's pretty close. If your hackle's a little big, no big deal. You can always take some scissors and trim it on the bottom. Sometimes that even helps it be more stable. And then we strip off some hackles on the end. And we tie that hackle on with several wraps in the front and a couple in the back. And bring our thread back forward. I'm going to build this up just a little. Now we got that. Next, you take your hackle pliers. Now I'm going to use the original kind, because that's what you're probably going to have, as opposed to my rotating one. To hackle in the clip. Whoops. And it came out, which happens a lot. Try that again. Came out again. I'm going to cheat and use my rotating hackle pliers because they hold a little better. And you just start rotating that hackle. Bring it around into the front. Like that. And I wet my fingers and I kind of pull that out of the way. Run 3 or 4 wraps. And some stragglers around the front. I'm going to tilt my fly back a little bit. Pull that to the front. My head build up just a hair. Now we're going to whip finish. Now I pulled the fly back, makes it easier to whip finish. If it's too far forward, sometimes it keeps pulling off. To use your whip finisher, you take the front hook, hook it on your line, like that. And you take the rest of the line, wrap it around the back and across the front. Looks like that. Then you just start wrapping it. Then you tilt it, slip it off the back, pull it through the front, snug it up. And I got some stragglers around the eye. No big deal. Now, a common mistake is to start all this too close to the front and you get too close to the eye, and then it's hard to get that final knot and you cover up the eye itself. You can't get your tippet through there. Well, there's something simple. Simple mayfly. Not that hard to tie. Give it a try. Okay, this next fly we're going to tie, it's not hard fly, but it's really cool. It's called an elk hair caddis. Again, I'm using a size 14 hook. It's a little different than the last one. It's a great trout fly. Again, we start our thread, trim it off, run it onto the back. Now, this is, the ribbing on this is going to actually be a hackle. Makes the body bushy. Now, this hackle's a little different. It's called a Cree, but you notice how it's uniform and real long. You can buy these in packs of 8 or 10, and they're nice because they're made for the size hook you're using. And out of one of these long hackles, you can get several flies. So I just cut off a section of it. It's a little more than I needed. I'll take the small tip, tie that, bring it on back. And trim this off. Okay. Now on this fly, I'm going to use a dubbing tool. This thing. What the heck? How do you use that? Well, you make what's called a dubbing loop. Pull out the thread, quite a bit of it. Hold it with your finger. Come back up a couple wraps, bring it around, hold that together. And bring your thread forward to about the third point. Then you take this thing and you hook it into the loop like that. It holds it apart. Now we're going to take our dubbing. Again, not a whole lot. And you put it inside that loop and you kind of spread it out a little bit like that. Then you spin the dubbing tool. You keep turning it and spinning it. And you'll see how it starts to pull that dubbing together. This is called a dubbing rope. You can keep spinning it. Makes a real strong dubbing body. It won't come apart on you. And once you get the rope made, you start bringing that dubbing rope forward. And when you get it where you want it, you just tie that off. And then you trim off your dubbing rope. Very easy. Okay, now we're going to take our hackle and we're going to start bringing that forward. Nice even wraps. Whoa. Tie that off. You can do that with your hand or you can use your hackle pliers. And then we trim it. Extra dubbing in the way. Get rid of that. Okay. And the last step on this is called an elk hair caddis. I'm just going to use deer hair. You can use elk hair or deer hair. And we take off several. Cut them off close. Like that. Take out the extra. Kind of brush it. You can take a comb as well and comb it. Get that stuff out. Okay. I'm going to put that in my stacker. You don't need a stacker for sure. You can kind of get the ends even. You can do it without a stacker. I've tied many of these and tap that stacker. You don't have to have this, but it works really well. Mostly even. Take them out of the stacker. Now we want that body about the length of the shank. Sorry, this is the wing. I'm going to hold this on top. We start with a couple loose wraps. Bring it forward. Then we tighten it down. Several tight wraps. Then we grab this whole bunch in the front and we cut it off like that. Kind of an angle. Get this straggler here. So it makes a little puff in the front. That's the head of the caddis. I'm going to run a couple more tight wraps. And a couple wraps in front. Another in back. And again, we're going to take our whip finisher now. Hook it in the front, bring it around in the back hook, bring that line across, and then we start wrapping. 4 or 5 wraps, unclip it, pull it, snug it up. And trim it off. Now, what I like to do on my elk hair caddis on that, I take my head cement, put a little drop on my pin, put it right on that thread. That'll take it a couple minutes to dry, unless you're using a UV style. There we got it. A little bit of dubbing sticking out the back there. Trim that off. Elk hair caddis. Pretty easy to tie in. These are fantastic trout flies. They're one of my go-to flies. Okay, let's move on to the last beginner fly we're going to tie. Okay, now this last fly we're going to tie, it's a bluegill fly. I call it the best bluegill fly ever, and it is. It's going to be a bead head. Now, I got a box of various bead sizes that I've bought over the years. You want to buy several different sizes because depending on your hook size, it'll depend on what size bead that you use. You buy tungsten beads, which are heavy and kind of gray colored. We're going to use a brass bead on a size 12 hook. Now, you look at the bead real close and you find there's two holes in them, a narrow hole and then a wider hole. You put the hook through the smaller hole. You run it up to the eye. If your bead's too big, it'll slide over the eye of the hook. So you want a bead that the eye of the hook will stop from going forward. Put that on like that. Now we'll use black thread for this. When I put this thread on my bobbin, I use a bobbin threader. And you would basically slide that in, run the end of your thread through that loop, and then just pull it through. Makes it easy to get your thread on the bobbin. If you don't have one, you start the thread down here and you suck on this end and you can suck it through. That's a lot harder. Okay, and we just start our thread behind the bead like we did before. Now what I usually do is I'll build up a little bit of a dam. It won't hold that bead, but as we put material on, it'll hold it in place. I get a little dam built up in front of that bead just to get it started. Then we bring our thread on back. Now for the tail, use these fluffy neck hackles. We come back towards the base of it, these softer hackles. Get a group of them. Trim them off. Make the tail about the length of the hook shank. We tie them right on top. Kind of pull them up and it keeps them on top. Now, in addition, use some of this stuff, kind of a red flash material. Cut it off even. And I'm going to put some of that on the tail as well. And we'll trim that off. Good flashy red tail. Then we'll take another piece of the same material. We're going to use for ribbing. And we tie that on. Now for the body, take some black dubbing. Spread it out on the hook or on the thread Wet your fingers, twist it on, and make our dubbing noodle. And we start bringing that forward. Then we take our ribbing, bring that forward, fairly even spaces, tie that off, and trim it off. Okay. Now we're going to take some more of that fluffy neck hackle. Strip some off the bottom. And we're just going to wrap that several times. Tie it off. Trim it. See the advantage of the rotating vise? I can turn this up so I can get to that feather easily. Otherwise, I'm trying to get underneath it and I might cut my thread. Next, you take all that hackle, wet your fingers, and roll it back. And then you come back and tie it here so it makes it stick back. Cut off some straggler. Okay. Now next, I'm going to just take some gray dubbing. Not very much. I may put a little more on after I get started here. Wrap that up like that. And we take our whip finisher, front hook, back hook, cross it over, four or five loops, snug that up, trim it off. Now you can use this next step, you can use head cement. I tied plenty of these with that. In this case, I'm going to use some of this UV because it works quicker. And I'm just going to coat that dubbing with that UV cement. And hit it with the UV light. I can come around like this if it's a fixed vise. If it's rotating, I can just cook it and rotate it like that. That head cement or the UV holds that bead in place, makes a good solid dubbing head. It actually makes it a little heavier so it'll sink better. This is a wet fly. That's got it. There we have best bluegill fly ever. Easy fly to tie. Very effective. And I think you'll really enjoy using it. Okay. Now, I want to mention something I forgot to mention earlier. It's about thread sizes. There's two basic size scales. There's the aught scale and the denier scale. Now, in the aught scale, you can get, 10-aught, 8-aught, 6-aught. The higher the number, the smaller the thread, the weaker the thread. When you get started, I recommend you use either 6-aught or denier 140. Now, with denier, it's the opposite. The higher the number, the stronger the thread. 6-aught and 140 denier are about the same, and they're stronger thread. And if you get lighter thread than that, you'll tend to break it when you snug things up, especially after you whip finished. I've done that many times, so I pretty much stick with 140 or 6-aught. You can tie most of your flies with that. You might want to drop down one size smaller if you're tying a small midge on a size 20 hook. But generally, 140 or 6-aught are what you ought to start out with. Now, another point I want to make. There's a lot of gear junkies out there. And, they'll say if you use anything less expensive than a $800 vise, it's a beginner's. Well, that vise I used, and I've used it for 30 years, when I bought it, it probably cost $100. Now, today, it's about $200 due to inflation. It's not a super expensive vise, but it served me very well for many, many years. And I don't consider it a beginner's vise. I consider it a great vise, and it works very well. It's the same idea with fly rods. These guys, they won't have anything less than a $900 Orvis fast action fly rod. Anything else is a beginner's rod or a backup rod. Well, for years and years, I've used Fenwick and Reddington. These rods cost under $300, $250, $210. They got great action, and I don't consider them beginner's rods. I've used them for years and years, and they work great for me. They fit my style of casting. They're very accurate, very sensitive. Great rods. Now, you're getting started, especially if you're a kid and you can't even afford the $200 rod. Go on into Walmart's, look at the Shakespeare's, grab the rods off the rack, whip them around, see how they feel. If they feel good to you, go ahead and get them. Because when you get started, the whole trick is to get out on the water and use these flies that you've tied. Because there's nothing more exciting than catching a trout or a bluegill or a bass on a fly that you just tied. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I enjoyed making it. I hope you learned something. And I hope you get into the hobby, because it's fantastic, and it'll stick with you from when you're a young kid all the way to an old geezer like me. So, hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe.